Well, anytime there is a mass shooting in the United States or whenever the Ecole Polytechnique shooting anniversary comes around, the Liberal government seizes the moment to ban more firearms from legal gun owners in Canada. Despite the fact that 85% of guns involved in crime in this country come from the United States, and despite the fact that a minuscule amount of crime is committed by legal and licensed gun owners, the federal government just continues to ban firearms. Well, that was exactly what happened earlier on in December when the federal government added 324 makes and models to the banned list of firearms, now making that list over 2,000. These firearms that are now banned in Canada range from your .22 long rifles to your World War II era anti-aircraft machine guns, which, by the way, were already banned in this country, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Joining us now on the Faulkner Show is Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer Ian Runkle. He's also the founder of the YouTube channel Runkle of the Bailey. Let's just get right into it. Ian, why does the Liberal government keep banning firearms?
I mean, my cynical answer is because their poll numbers are not great. But there's other reasons they might have as well. They really don't like the sort of dynamic shooting sports, and this really seems to be targeted at that. They say there's no sporting use for this, but it's very clear that they actually paid attention to what sports people are engaged in and targeted the firearms that are used in those sports. So when they say no sporting use, I think that is a little dishonest. So that's really where this is aimed.
And take us through some of this. The new ban has 324 makes and models of what the government calls assault-style firearms, right? But there is really no definition for what assault-style means. That's not actually a classification. But take us through the guns that are now banned in Canada. Are these guns that Canadian firearms owners really own, or are some of them like novelty guns?
It's all over the place. One thing that they said that they newly banned, which was actually banned for forever, was the M3 aircraft, which is a heavy machine gun designed to be mounted to aircraft. That was already banned because it's full auto, and those have been banned since the 70s. But there's also a lot of what we'd call sort of plinking guns, like .22 caliber firearms. And a lot of these are things that are just basically fairly boring conventional firearms, but some of them were sort of built to look like older firearms. So one of them, for instance, is built to look like the old German MP40. It's not an MP40, not at all. But because it looks like one, they're like, we have to ban this. And that applies even to things that are .22 long rifle, which is a very small, very inexpensive caliber that people typically use to hunt grouse or rabbits or just target shooting. So a ton of these are just really target shooting kinds of guns. And a number of them are things that when they announced the last ban, they said, we're not trying to shut down these sports. People can buy alternative firearms. And so they then looked at what the alternative firearms people bought in order to continue their shooting sports, as the government said they could, and then they turned and banned those as well. So they've also admitted, you mentioned that assault style is kind of meaningless, and I use the example of saying if you go to a restaurant and they have a beef style burger, it can contain all sorts of things, but it's not going to contain any beef. Whereas they actually are in federal court, in the Federal Court of Appeal. They were just there this last week, and they admitted that assault style is not a term that has any meaning. They admitted in court that was a meaningless term, and it's just one that they made up to describe the guns that they banned. So if the meaning of assault style is the guns we banned, when they say we banned assault style firearms, all that means is we banned the guns we decided to ban.
And is any crime being committed with the guns that are now being banned by the government? That's the question that I'm trying to figure out as well, because from what I can see, it doesn't appear that way.
These are not the guns that are typically implicated in crimes. What we usually see in sort of If you go to sort of the larger urban centers, you see handguns smuggled from the US. And we know that they're smuggled from the US because these are almost always models that were prohibited beforehand because they're short barrel lengths. People preferred to bring those in because, of course, they're criminals walking around, a gun tucked in their pocket as they're dealing drugs. They want something extremely concealable. If you go rural, what you're most often seeing is actually just sawed off rifles or sawed off shotguns, and none of those are the kinds of guns you see here. They're typically just sort of somebody's hunting rifle or something like that that's been sawed down. And but the use of what they're calling assault style firearms in crime in Canada is actually really, really rare. These are things that were used by hunters and sport shooters and not very popular in the criminal population. That gets even more so when you look at the previous order in council, which also banned the over 10,000 joules category. Some of those guns have now showed up on the buyback with prices of $50,000, $100,000, and that's actually a dramatic underpricing for those guns. But nobody is robbing their local convenience store with $100,000 bespoke rifle. It's just not happening. Because if you had the $100,000 rifle, you'd just sell that. And nobody is using, they say these, large caliber rifles. These are used by sports shooters, but nobody's using them to commit robberies because sometimes they're as tall as I am. And you're not going to, stand at the street corner peddling, crack when you're also sitting there with a gun that is as big as you are. It's just not going to work. So these are really silly bans.
So I assume it follows then that if the guns that are being banned are not being used typically in gun crime, then I'm assuming that legal firearms, licensed firearms owners are also not really that involved in gun crime as well in this country. Is that right as well?
I mean, when you see the crimes that like gun owners get arrested for, it'll be something like careless storage because somebody, for instance,
right.
I had a case where somebody went to an airport and they didn't realize they needed 2 locks instead of 1 lock. And so and that goes into the gun crime statistics as, this is a licensed gun owner. But nobody really is worried about this guy because, A, the gun was locked. It was just whether it had a second lock on it. And B, the guy's not there to do violence. He's not there to stick up a plane. He's there to go to another country for a shooting competition. And he's no threat to anybody. Violence, Canada has a different sort of system than the US where we have firearms licenses. We can actually track crime by licensed people with a firearms license versus not. And what we find is that people with a firearms license commit violent crime at a rate that is vastly below the general population, not above.
Okay, so that's hardly surprising. I think the majority of Canadians, even if they support this, know that in the back of their heads because they just look at this, they look at the statistics, they look at the news. But let's just play this out. So how is this ban going to work, right? There's obviously a gun buyback program, which I want to have you kind of discuss that. I gather that there's been no guns collected since. But how does this work? So if you happen to own one of these newly banned firearm models, are the police going to knock on your door and expect you to hand over the gun? What is this going to look like?
They haven't said exactly. Phase 1, because they're trying to get past that the talking point of not a single gun collected. Phase 1 is going to be aimed at retailers, and retailers are a lot easier to target. There's a limited number of them. They have to maintain an inventory. And so when they start talking about we've collected X many guns, it's going to be from businesses. But after that, they're going to move on to phase 2. And we don't know a whole lot about phase 2, although they have hinted that they might actually be going to people's houses in order to demand these firearms. This will be easier for the ones that were formerly restricted, like the AR models, because then they'll have people's, addresses of where they were and so forth. But a lot of these firearms, tons of these firearms, especially on the further list, were non-restricted. And so there aren't really records of who has them. And this is going to be a big issue, especially because a lot of the people who might be covered by this may not even be aware of it. A lot of people just don't follow the news. And a lot of people, I've seen gun owners say, well, this doesn't affect me. And then when I ask them, well, what guns do you own? It turns out they are actually affected, because there's a fair number of people who think, there's a ban on assault style firearms. They look at their collection. They say, well, I'm just a hunter who occasionally goes plinking in the woods. I shoot some cans, and there's no way they'd be coming after my guns because I'm not I don't use anything sort of scary. And when they don't realize that, there's going to be decades of them just finding some guy going out hunting in the woods, and a fish and wildlife officer goes, I got a question about that gun you've got. This may be especially felt in, for instance, indigenous communities, which so I sort of cynically, this is going to put a lot of people in jail who really have not committed any sort of moral wrong. This is going to be a disaster, and they propose to use Canada Post. Canada Post wants nothing to do with this because that makes them suddenly a huge target. If a Canada Post truck is driving around and people think, oh, well, that's full of guns, then that might be a really tempting target. They'll have to worry about diversion internally. If some Canada Post employee decides, you know what, maybe I'll take a few of these home. How do they prevent that? They'll also have to deal with people who want to sort of mess with the program. You may have somebody who gets their, special box to take home their, or to send back their rifle, and decides to just put a brick in it. Well, as Canada Post, they'll have to figure out where that brick came in. Was it the guy who sent it? Was it somewhere along the lines of the whole Canada Post chain? Did somebody cut into that and swap out a gun for a brick? This just creates an incredible oversight problem, and they want nothing to do with it. Police forces also don't want anything to do with it because they're concerned for all sorts of reasons. And also, a lot of the people targeted are police. The police are not super thrilled by this because, like, the handgun transfer ban is a problem for a lot of police officers. They may want to practice at home with a gun that's similar to what they use on duty, and they can't do it. Same thing with the ban on the AR-15. If you saw who did some of these dynamic competitions, you'd always find some police officers there. It's, asking the police to target the police is not really going to be a very winning proposition, I don't think.
Let's get into this indigenous angle because, indigenous issues are very sensitive in this country, especially with this federal government. They like to use the indigenous people and indigenous causes to score their own political points. But this is obviously going to impact indigenous communities. I gather that there's a specific gun that is now banned. I believe it's the SKS, something along those lines. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that indigenous hunters have been using for many years now. And many of them maybe even rely on these guns for hunting.
The SKS didn't make the list this time, but they did float that they might add it in February because they've said we're going to ban more guns. Okay. And it is a very... the SKS, for the people who aren't familiar with it, it's a semi-automatic, but it has a fixed magazine, although it can be modified to allow a detachable magazine. But the SKS is it's old Soviet technology. It was basically designed to be a semi-automatic firearm before the Soviet Union realized that the AK-47 would be a better choice, and they went in that direction. So essentially, they made a whole bunch of these on the notion that Russian peasants would do better with semi-autos than with full auto, and then changed their mind. But these ended up, and they were very cheap on the surplus market for a long time. And they're perfectly good for shooting deer. They're perfectly good for shooting all sorts of things. And so they've become very popular on reserves and very popular just in Canada. many gun owners own an SKS in addition to other things. So if they do get around to banning the SKS, they're going to basically end up declaring war on the indigenous population, because they're going to be going, we need your hunting rifles.
Wow.
And that's not going to go over well. It's
No. So I also want to ask you this question, right? There's a video that has been floating around of Justin Trudeau before he became prime minister. He's speaking to reporters on the Hill. I believe you may know the video I'm talking about, when Justin Trudeau talks about defending the rights of gun owners. Where did Justin Trudeau suddenly decide to change his perspective on this issue? I mean, it's a 180 of epic proportions.
The thing is I would say, where did he decide? But he's done so many 180s. It's kind of his thing.
Right.
So at this point, if he tells me that he's not going to do something, I'm like, well, that might be happening. But I think largely it's just raw cynicism. They seem to have decided that gun owners are an unpopular group, and that by dividing Canadians against Canadians, that he can bolster his political fortunes. A lot of people who are sort of, urban and may not hunt, may not have any experience with firearms, typically don't have a whole lot of sympathy, even when you start talking about somebody who, for instance, might be a subsistence hunter, or these might be family heirlooms. I end up dealing with lots of people who their grandfather dies, and they want to pass on some cherished family heirloom, and they can't because it's a handgun. And so that becomes a big issue. And I would like to see politicians who try to bring different groups of Canadians together and get them to understand each other's, issues. Rural Canadians need to understand urban Canadians, and vice versa. We need to have that. And ideally, we should all be sort of working together on the big problems rather than fighting each other over hobbies. This is really what it comes down to. I think everybody agrees that we want to stop crime, but this isn't going to stop any crime. The usual line is, if it saves one life. I don't think this is going to save any lives. This is kind of silly season here. It's just but we see this pattern of, when their political numbers start falling, they announce a ban. And it's
Well, and
unfortunate.
Ian, even more unfortunate is it's not just when their poll numbers decline. Sometimes that just coincides with it. But I also noticed that they do this on the anniversary, typically, of the École Polytechnique shooting. They also will make an announcement within weeks of a mass shooting in the United States to try to use that tragedy to advance their political agenda. I mean, that to me is, talk about sinister.
Well, it's very clear that the May Order in Council they had ready to go, because they announced it right after a shooting. And so it's like, this is something we want to do, but we're waiting for the ideal moment to do it. And I think if you get to the point in your life when you're sitting there hoping for a mass shooting so that you can advance your goals, you should probably go, wait a minute, am I doing something horrible? Like, is this something that I should be hoping for? But Police se souvient, or Police se souvient, basically is continuing to say, listen, if you want to show up at our sort of events, you need to do what we say. And so this time around, they announced this further round of bans, and then immediately thereafter, notwithstanding that they had been threatening to prevent Trudeau from appearing at this, he gets his photo op at that at that event. We've taken this very small lobby group and we've given them tremendous power, and maybe we should examine that, because what they're doing is not fact-based, not evidence-based. It's based on sort of antipathy towards a certain segment of the Canadian population.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Where does this leave the sports shooting industry and hobby. Is it basically almost gone now?
It really depends on what sport you're doing. If you are an Olympic shooter, well, it depends. If you're shooting Olympic handgun, how do you get into that sport now? If you are somebody who wants to one day be an Olympian, you already need to be an Olympian to get a new handgun. That's a problem. So we're going to take out, all of the handgun sports. If you want, and that includes things like cowboy action shooting. Cowboy action shooting is people who dress up in cowboy outfits and shoot with sort of old-timey guns. They're shooting with lever actions and break action shotguns and single action revolvers. And I'm thinking, these are not the guns that are showing up on, in crime scenes. If you're talking about the shooting sports that are most popular now in other countries, like 3-gun, you basically can't do 3-gun anymore. The handguns you can't acquire. All of the long guns that were used in it, they're banning, and they're specifically targeting the ones that appear to be popular with 3-gun. So there are some sports left, but they tend to be very niche sports. They weren't very popular. And this is really intended, I think, to try to damage and try to shrink the culture of gun owners in Canada and try to eliminate shooting sports as much as they can.
No, it's a real shame. Let's end it on a positive note, and I want to ask you, what are the firearms that licensed gun owners who just say have a non-restricted firearms license, what can they buy now? I mean, surely the list is getting quite small, right?
It's getting small. I mean, it depends on what kind of shooting you want to do. I don't want to name any I don't really want to name any models as encouragement because I'm worried that they'll add it to the next list. But I'm worried that if I name my hunting rifle, they're going to put that on the list. And
so hunting rifles, shotguns, some hunting rifles are still obviously legal. Shotguns,
mostly
that sort of
what
thing.
You can still get are bolt action rifles. And people say, why would you need a semi-automatic for hunting? And the reasons is a semi-automatic it sort of consumes a lot of the recoil, so there's less felt recoil, which makes it a much better target for people like me with a small build, or women who, same thing, small build. And sometimes you may need a follow-up shot. No matter how good of a hunter you are, eventually you may have a moment where you shoot an animal and it just doesn't, sort of immediately lie down. And then you might need a follow-up shot to avoid having to chase the animal. And if you're able to do that quickly, great. If not, you might be spending the entire day trying to pursue something to make sure that it's, sort of humanely killed. But they're really cracking down on that. So there's very few semi-automatic center fires left. There's a few semi-automatic rim firearms left, which are much smaller. And again, sort of you'd use those for grouse or rabbit or the like. But this is going to also put a tremendous damper on gun stores because, and these are mostly, small, in some cases, literally mom and pop businesses. I was just up in a small...
They can barely sell any weapons. They can barely sell any guns. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I was just up in a small town, and I go into the local gun store, and the guy is there. He's got tables out. It's a community sort of place where everybody sort of goes to have to socialize. And if he can't stay in business, then that little community network dies out. And it's tragic.
It is. And I think, the reality is because the government sees the gun community as not important to them, that they can use the gun community to score political points off of, this may just continue to get worse and the industry may continue to shrink. If it does, and if there are new announcements, we hope to have you back, Ian. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. Where can Canadians find your work and interact with you more on social media?
Mostly on YouTube at Runkle of the Bailey. That's the best place to track me down.
Perfect. We'll put a link to your channel in the description of this video. Ian Runkle, thank you very much once again for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.